In the bustling city of Chicago, where the streets were always busy and the buildings touched the sky, there was a famous hospital called Riverwood Medical Center. Dr. Samuel Harris was one of the best doctors in the hospital. He was tall, with graying hair and sharp eyes hidden behind thick glasses. Many people trusted him because he had helped countless patients get better. One chilly afternoon, a young man named Marcus Johnson was rushed into the emergency room. Marcus was about 25 years old, with dark skin and kind eyes. He had been in a terrible car accident, and his leg was bleeding badly. His mother, Mrs. Johnson, was right by his side, her face full of worry. "Please, someone help my son," she cried out as they wheeled Marcus into the emergency room. The nurses quickly brought Marcus into a room, and Dr. Harris was called to take care of him. But when Dr. Harris entered the room and saw Marcus, something changed in his face. He frowned, and his usual kind eyes turned cold. "I don't have time for this," Dr. Harris muttered under his breath. He turned to the nurse and said, "Find someone else to treat him." The nurse looked shocked. "But Dr. Harris, he's losing a lot of blood. We need to help him now." Dr. Harris shook his head. "I said, find someone else," he repeated, and walked out of the room. Mrs. Johnson was horrified. "Why won't he help my son?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. The nurse tried to stay calm. "Don't worry, ma'am. We'll get another doctor to take care of Marcus." As they waited for another doctor, Marcus's condition got worse. His breathing became shallow, and his skin grew pale. The minutes felt like hours to Mrs. Johnson. She held her son's hand tightly, praying for someone to come and save him. Finally, another doctor, Dr. Emily Parker, rushed into the room. She was younger than Dr. Harris, with a friendly smile and a warm heart. She immediately began to treat Marcus, working quickly to stop the bleeding and stabilize him. "You're going to be okay, Marcus," Dr. Parker said gently as she worked. "We're going to take good care of you." Mrs. Johnson sighed with relief, but the fear in her heart did not go away. She couldn't understand why Dr. Harris had refused to help her son just because of the color of his skin. As she watched Dr. Parker and the nurses work together to save Marcus, she wondered what kind of person Dr. Harris truly was. The next day, Dr. Harris continued with his work as if nothing had happened. He treated other patients, all the while avoiding any talk about what had occurred in the emergency room. But little did he know, his life was about to take a turn he never expected. That evening, as Dr. Harris was driving home, his car suddenly broke down on a quiet road just outside the city. It was getting dark, and the street was empty. Frustrated, he got out of the car and tried to figure out what was wrong. Just then, a car pulled up behind him. A man got out and walked over to Dr. Harris. The man was tall, with dark skin and a friendly smile. "Looks like you're having some trouble," the man said. "Need any help?" Dr. Harris hesitated. He was used to helping others, not the other way around. But as he looked at the man's kind face, he felt a strange sense of familiarity. "Yes, my car won't start," Dr. Harris finally said. "Do you know anything about cars?" The man nodded. "I used to be a mechanic." "Let's take a look." As the man worked on the car, Dr. Harris felt a mix of emotions. Here was a stranger, someone who looked very much like the patient he had refused to treat, now helping him in his time of need. After a few minutes, the man smiled and said, "There you go. It should start now." Dr. Harris turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He looked at the man, feeling both grateful and confused. "Thank you," Dr. Harris said slowly. "I appreciate your help." The man simply nodded and said, "Take care, doctor." With that, he got back into his car and drove away, leaving Dr. Harris standing there, deep in thought. As Dr. Harris drove home that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. He started to question his actions and the way he treated people, especially those who were different from him. What Dr. Harris didn't realize was that this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger. The next morning, Dr. Harris arrived at Riverwood Medical Center feeling uneasy. His thoughts kept drifting back to the man who had helped him on the road. The man's kindness and the resemblance to Marcus weighed heavily on his mind. As he walked into the hospital, Dr. Harris noticed that people were whispering and glancing at him. The usual respect in their eyes seemed to have faded. Puzzled, he made his way to his office, where he found a note on his desk. It was from Dr. Parker. "Dr. Harris, we need to talk. Please meet me in my office." Dr. Harris felt a knot in his stomach as he walked to Dr. Parker's office. When he arrived, Dr. Parker was waiting for him, her expression serious. "Have a seat, Dr. Harris," she said. Dr. Harris sat down, trying to remain calm. "What's this about?" Dr. Parker looked him in the eye. "It's about what happened with Marcus Johnson. The nurses told me you refused to treat him." Dr. Harris stiffened. "I was busy. I didn't have time, Dr. Harris," Dr. Parker interrupted. "You and I both know that wasn't the reason. You left a patient in a critical condition because of his skin color." Dr. Harris didn't know what to say. He had never been confronted like this before. Word has spread through the hospital. People are questioning your actions, and I have to say, I'm questioning them too. This isn't just about one patient. It's about how we treat every human being who comes through those doors. Dr. Harris looked down at his hands, feeling ashamed for the first time. I didn't mean for things to get this out of hand." Dr. Parker sighed. "Dr. Harris, we've worked together for years. I know you're a skilled doctor, but this isn't right. Marcus could have died because of your decision. We're supposed to save lives, not judge who deserves to be saved." There was a long silence in the room. Dr. Harris felt like the walls were closing in on him. He wanted to defend himself, but deep down, he knew Dr. Parker was right. "I need to think about this," Dr. Harris finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Parker nodded. "I hope you do. And I hope you realize that every patient deserves our best care, no matter what." As Dr. Harris left Dr. Parker's office, he felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. He knew he had made a mistake, but he wasn't sure how to fix it. For the first time, he wondered if he was truly the kind of doctor he always thought he was. That afternoon, as Dr. Harris sat in his office trying to focus on his work, there was a knock at the door. Before he could answer, the door opened, and Mrs. Johnson walked in. Dr. Harris was surprised to see her. He stood up, unsure of what to say. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, I'm sorry about what happened yesterday." Mrs. Johnson looked at him with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Dr. Harris, I didn't come here for an apology. I came to tell you something." Dr. Harris nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Marcus is going to be okay, thanks to Dr. Parker and the other nurses," Mrs. Johnson said. "But I need you to understand something. My son's life is just as valuable as anyone else's. He's a good person, and he deserves to be treated with respect. Dr. Harris looked at her, seeing the pain in her eyes. You're right, Mrs. Johnson. I lost sight of that. I made a terrible mistake. Mrs. Johnson sighed. I don't know what made you do what you did, Dr. Harris, but I hope you learn from it. There's too much hate in this world already. We need more kindness, more understanding. Dr. Harris felt tears sting his eyes. I want to do better, Mrs. Johnson. I really do. Mrs. Johnson nodded. Then start by treating the next person who comes into this hospital like you would want your own family to be treated. With that, Mrs. Johnson turned and left the office, leaving Dr. Harris alone with his thoughts. He sat down at his desk, feeling a strange mix of regret and hope. He knew he couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could change the future. Days passed, and the atmosphere at Riverwood Medical Center remained tense. Dr. Harris could feel the judgmental eyes of his colleagues and the nurses who once looked up to him. The guilt of what he had done gnawed at him, making it hard to sleep at night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of Marcus and Mrs. Johnson, reminding him of the gravity of his actions. One evening, as Dr. Harris was about to leave the hospital, he noticed a flyer on the bulletin board near the entrance. It was an invitation to a community event aimed at promoting unity and understanding among people of different races and backgrounds. The event was organized by the local community center and was scheduled for that weekend. Dr. Harris hesitated for a moment, then tore off one of the small tabs with the event's details. He slipped it into his pocket, not sure if he would go but feeling a pull to do something different. The day of the event arrived, and Dr. Harris found himself driving to the community center. He felt nervous and out of place as he parked his car and walked towards the building. The center was buzzing with activity, with people from all walks of life coming together to share stories, food, and laughter. Dr. Harris entered the main hall, where a large group of people had gathered. There were speakers on a stage talking about their experiences with discrimination and the importance of empathy. Dr. Harris listened intently, feeling a deep sense of shame and sorrow as he realized how much he had contributed to the problem. As he moved through the crowd, Dr. Harris spotted a familiar face. It was the man who had helped him with his car, the man who looked so much like Marcus. The man was standing by a table, talking to a group of children who were eagerly listening to him. Dr. Harris felt a pang of guilt as he approached the man. "Excuse me," he said softly. The man turned around and smiled when he recognized Dr. Harris. "Doctor, I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here either," Dr. Harris admitted. I wanted to thank you again for helping me that night. And I wanted to apologize for how I've acted." The man's smile faded a little, and he nodded. "I appreciate that, doctor. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Dr. Harris sighed. "I've made some terrible mistakes. I've treated people unfairly, and I realize now how wrong I was. Seeing you here, helping these kids, makes me realize how much I need to change." The man looked at Dr. Harris thoughtfully. "Change is never easy, but it's necessary. We all have to learn to see each other as human beings, not as labels or stereotypes. It's about treating each other with respect and kindness, no matter what." Dr. Harris nodded, feeling a weight lifting off his shoulders. "I want to do better. I don't want to be the person who turns away from someone in need just because of the color of their skin." The man placed a hand on Dr. Harris's shoulder. "It's never too late to start. The fact that you're here, trying to understand, is a good first step." As the two men talked, Dr. Harris began to see the world through a different lens. He realized that the prejudices he held were not just hurting others, but also keeping him from truly connecting with the people around him. The conversation left him feeling more determined than ever to make things right. The next day, Dr. Harris returned to Riverwood Medical Center with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that changing his ways wouldn't be easy, but he was committed to doing it. His first test came sooner than he expected. As Dr. Harris was making his rounds, a new patient was brought into the emergency room. The patient, a young woman named Rosa, had been in a serious accident and needed immediate surgery. She was of Hispanic descent, with long dark hair and a frightened look in her eyes. Dr. Harris felt the familiar tug of hesitation as he looked at Rosa, but he quickly pushed it aside. He reminded himself of the promise he had made to Mrs. Johnson and the words of the man who had helped him. Rosa was a human being in need of help, and it was his duty to provide it. Without a second thought, Dr. Harris took charge of Rosa's care. He worked alongside the nurses, ensuring that she received the best treatment possible. As he performed the surgery, Dr. Harris felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He was finally doing what he had always been meant to do, saving lives, without judgment or prejudice. After the surgery, Dr. Harris visited Rosa in the recovery room. She was still unconscious, but her condition was stable. Dr. Harris watched her for a moment, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He knew that this was just the beginning of his journey, but it was a step in the right direction. As Dr. Harris left the recovery room, he caught a glimpse of Dr. Parker in the hallway. She gave him a nod, a small but significant gesture of approval. Dr. Harris smiled back, knowing that he was finally on the path to becoming the doctor and the person he always should have been. A few days later, Dr. Harris received an unexpected visitor in his office. It was Mr. Johnson, Marcus's father. He was a tall man with a strong presence, his face lined with the marks of years of hard work. Dr. Harris felt a wave of anxiety as Mr. Johnson stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Dear Harris," Mr. Johnson began, his voice steady but serious, "I came here to talk about what happened with my son." Dr. Harris swallowed hard, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "Mr. Johnson, I'm deeply sorry for how I treated Marcus. It was wrong, and I regret it every day." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've heard you've been trying to make things right. My wife told me you apologized, and that you're trying to change." "I am," Dr. Harris replied earnestly. "I've realized how much harm my actions caused, and I'm committed to being better for all my patients." Mr. Johnson studied Dr. Harris for a moment, then took a seat across from him. "You know, Dr. Harris, when I first heard what happened, I was furious. I wanted to come here and give you a piece of my mind. But after talking with my wife and seeing how hard Marcus fought to recover, I realized that holding onto that anger wouldn't help anyone." Dr. Harris listened intently, feeling both relief and humility. "I can't undo the past, Mr. Johnson, but I want to make sure it never happens again. Not just with me, but with the way this hospital treats all its patients." Mr. Johnson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Words are easy, doctor. It's actions that count. If you're serious about this, then you need to do more than just treat your patients fairly. You need to make sure this hospital is a place where everyone feels safe and respected." Dr. Harris nodded, fully understanding the weight of Mr. Johnson's words. "You're right. I've been thinking about that too. I want to start by offering training for the staff on cultural sensitivity and anti-bias. We all need to learn how to do better." Mr. Johnson looked at Dr. Harris, a small smile forming on his lips. "That's a good start, Doctor. If you need any help with that, I'm here. I'm a community leader, and I know people who can assist with that kind of training." Dr. Harris felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I would appreciate your help. Together, we can make this hospital a place where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve." Mr. Johnson stood up, extending his hand. "I hope you mean that, Dr. Harris. Because if you do, you'll not only be a better doctor, you'll be a better man." Dr. Harris shook Mr. Johnson's hand, feeling a deep sense of respect for the man standing before him. "I won't let you down," he promised. As Mr. Johnson left the office, Dr. Harris felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that transforming himself and the hospital wouldn't happen overnight, but he was ready to put in the work. It was time to lead by example, to prove through his actions that he was committed to change. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Harris, with the support of Mr. Johnson and other community leaders, began implementing new training programs at Riverwood Medical Center. The staff attended workshops on cultural competence, implicit bias, and the importance of empathy in healthcare. These sessions were designed to help everyone, from doctors to nurses to administrative staff, understand how their actions and attitudes could impact patients from different backgrounds. At first, there was some resistance. Not everyone was comfortable confronting their own biases, and some staff members were skeptical about the need for such training. But as the sessions continued, a shift began to occur. People started sharing their own experiences and listening to each other's stories. Walls that had been built up over years of misunderstanding and prejudice began to come down. Dr. Harris was at the forefront of these efforts, attending every session and participating actively. He shared his own story, admitting his mistakes and explaining how he was working to change. His openness and humility earned him the respect of his colleagues, many of whom began to see him in a new light. One day, after a particularly moving session, Dr. Parker approached Dr. Harris in the hallway. "You've come a long way, Samuel," she said, using his first name for the first time in years. "I'm proud of the work you're doing." Dr. Harris smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Emily. I couldn't have done it without your support and without the wake-up call I got from Marcus and his family." Dr. Parker nodded. "It's a good reminder that we all have room to grow, and that change is possible even when it seems difficult." As they talked, a young nurse named Sarah walked by and overheard their conversation. She had joined the hospital only a few months ago and had been one of the staff members most resistant to the new training. But seeing the changes in Dr. Harris and hearing his story had made her think differently. Later that day, Sarah found herself in the pediatric ward, caring for a little girl who had just undergone surgery. The girl was scared and in pain, her small hands clutching her mother's as she whimpered softly. The mother, who wore a headscarf and spoke with a heavy accent, looked just as frightened as her daughter. Sarah knelt beside the bed and gently took the girl's hand. "It's okay, sweetie," she said softly. "You're safe now, and we're going to take good care of you." The mother looked at Sarah, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. In that moment, Sarah realized that the training wasn't just about learning new skills. It was about seeing people, really seeing them for who they were, beyond the surface differences. It was about connecting on a human level, something that transcended race, language, and culture. As Sarah left the room, she felt a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a caregiver, a healer. And she was determined to carry forward the lessons she had learned, just as Dr. Harris was doing. Months passed, and the changes at Riverwood Medical Center became more evident with each passing day. The hospital had transformed into a place where every patient, regardless of their background, felt welcome and respected. The staff, once divided by unspoken biases, now worked together with a renewed sense of unity and purpose. Dr. Harris, who had once been at the center of controversy, was now seen as a leader in promoting equality and compassion within the hospital. He had earned back the respect of his colleagues, but more importantly, he had earned back his own self-respect. The journey had been challenging, but it had brought out the best in him. One day, as Dr. Harris was finishing his rounds, he received a call from the front desk. A patient had requested to see him. Curious, Dr. Harris made his way to the waiting room. When he arrived, he was surprised to see Marcus Johnson sitting there, looking healthy and strong. "Marcus," Dr. Harris exclaimed, genuinely happy to see him. "You're looking great. How are you feeling?" Marcus stood up and shook Dr. Harris's hand. "I'm doing well, doctor. Thanks to you and Dr. Parker, I made a full recovery." Dr. Harris felt a swell of emotion. "I'm glad to hear that. You've been on my mind a lot." Marcus smiled. "I wanted to come by and thank you in person. I've heard about all the changes you've made here, and I wanted you to know that I appreciate it. It means a lot to me and my family." Dr. Harris nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Marcus. Your experience changed my life. I'm just glad I could make a difference." Marcus paused for a moment, then said, "I think it's time to put the past behind us, doctor. You've shown that people can change, and I believe in giving second chances." Dr. Harris felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more to me than you can imagine." As they talked, Dr. Parker walked by and noticed the two of them. She smiled and joined the conversation. "Looks like we've come full circle," she said, glancing between the two men. "Yes, we have," Marcus agreed. "And I'm grateful for it." The three of them stood together, a symbol of the change that had taken place at Riverwood Medical Center, a change that had begun with one man's mistake and ended with a commitment to making things right. The story of Dr. Harris and Marcus Johnson became a powerful example within the community and beyond. Other hospitals and institutions began to take note, implementing similar programs to address bias and promote equality. Dr. Harris was invited to speak at medical conferences, sharing his journey and encouraging others to embrace change. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the lives of the people who walked through the doors of Riverwood Medical Center. Patients from all backgrounds now knew that they would receive the care and respect they deserved. The staff, once hesitant and divided, had become a close-knit team, united by a shared commitment to compassion and understanding. As for Dr. Harris, he continued to grow both as a doctor and as a person. He knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more ways to improve. But he was ready for the challenge, confident that he was on the right path. And as he looked out at the bustling hospital, filled with the sound of laughter and life, he knew that the story wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had come together to make Riverwood Medical Center a place of healing, not just for the body, but for the soul. And in that, Dr. Harris found peace.